Steve the Amateur Historian.
Hi everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here with a story that I've been contemplating doing a video on since I first heard about it, which was almost 1.5 years ago. And I actually, to get things going before I delve into anything regarding this case, I actually shot a little intro piece where I went to the site where this story that I'm going to tell you happened. And I shot it probably, I don't know, 5-6 months ago. You'll know because I have considerably less hair on my head. And it was me paying a visit to the site and discussing how I came to know this particular case. So I wanted to start with that video since it kind of gets the ball rolling for this whole thing. So I'm going to start with that video and then you'll be coming back to me. It's 1:30 in the afternoon and all I have in my body is an energy drink. I feel like I'm going to explode. I'm in Northeast Portland, actually a pretty quiet part of Northeast Portland, and I'm guessing there probably used to be a house here, but it was gone because Portland is always in the throes of, at least in recent years, the demolition crisis. That's one of the big, key, hot button things. It's been a hot button thing in the city for the last couple of years, is the fact that these developers who come from places way far away from Portland don't give a crap what happens to this city because they don't have to live here. All they know is this place has been bringing in a lot of newcomers, and a lot of those newcomers have had money, so these developers are coming in, buying properties, you know, with little old houses on them, cheap properties that, you know, people are in dire need of in this city. They're buying them up, you know, buying them for $200,000, $300,000, knocking the house down, building sometimes 2 to 3 expensive houses in their place and selling them off for a minimum $500,000–$600,000. I'm going to bring you a story today that I learned about last summer and kind of muddled about whether I wanted to do a video about it or not, whether it was really worth it. But it came to me last summer when I was walking all over the city and I was shooting video where houses were being demolished or being prepped to be demolished or had been demolished, or new houses were in the process of being built in their place, so on and so forth. And I was doing that because I was planning on doing a big film last summer that didn't quite happen. It was going to be about the demolition crisis and all the problems that that's creating for this city and how the developers just don't care. I was going through Google Maps because I would find all the locations that had recently been demoed or prepped for demoing. So I wanted to find those spots on Google Maps to see what their current state was. And I'd take, you know, screen capture of each one. And a particular one was located along this street I'm walking on right now, which is 66th Avenue, Northeast 66th Avenue. And there was a house that was demoed a little while back. And it was a decent sized property with a kind of little crappy house on it. So once the property became available, of course the developers jumped right on that. Why wouldn't you? You have a good sized property you can build more than one home on. You're gonna do it. But what's interesting in terms of this story is not that people got their hands on a piece of property and then developed it. That happens all over town. It's the story behind how the property became available for them to develop on. And that's a story that I'm going to bring to you now. get around this bush here, we've got ourselves three. One of them's hidden, but you can see we have three homes here, recently built. This is the former site of 3934 Southeast 66th Avenue. And see, this is a pretty good lot. These three houses were all built on one lot that just one little crappy house used to be on. This site, again, where these big houses are, I don't want to film them for too long because I don't want some crazy lunatic coming out thinking I'm menacing them. But right there, that spot behind me where those three houses are, that was where a small house was that was owned by a guy named Gary Allen. Gary Allen Lewis. I had looked at information for a while, so he's regarded as Gary Lewis, and for some reason I just thought Gary Allen, because Allen's the guy's middle name. And his house was back there, where those three big ones are now. And this guy came to prominence in the summer of 2014 because he took on a tenant at his house, either because he needed the rent money or had the free space and, hey, extra income, possibly. So he took in a boarder, essentially. And not too long after he did that, something happened. I'm just gonna say it like that so I don't ruin the story for you, because here's the story about Gary Lewis and the property, the house as well, that used to be located where these three new houses are today. Alright, so the case involving Gary Allen Lewis. Gary Lewis, who again lived at that North Portland or Northeast Portland address. He'd lived there for, I think, over 20 years. He was regarded by many people as a survivalist of sorts. He was reportedly very anti-government. He felt like the collapse of America, perhaps of civilization, was always right around the corner, so he was always getting himself ready for when the shit hit the fan, so to speak. He was known for, according to some sources, he claimed to have a wine cellar that he made underneath his property, but anybody who was in the know said that it was a bunker to hide in once doomsday happened. Going back to 2012, there was actually like online resources or online sources that showed that Gary Allen Lewis was very much preparing for the doomsday, whatever that was going to be to come. He had a moderate criminal record. A lot of it was from back in the 80s. He was a drug addict back in the 80s. He got busted for possession back then. And it's interesting that that happened because he had to go to Narcotics Anonymous back then. And while he was doing that, he met a woman named Renee Sandage. Her full name is actually hyphenated, Sandage Crowell, but I notice a lot of sources just refer to her as Renee Sandage, who was also there dealing with her own, drug problems. And so they got to know each other way back in the 80s, over 30 years ago. It said that his drug conviction was, I think, back in 1983. So they'd known each other for decades when you fast forward to 2013. And Gary Lewis is living in his house with his wife and his daughter. He also had a son, but I think he was old enough to where he was on his own. But his daughter was only 15. Or I guess she was probably 14 at this time, 2013. And Gary Lewis decides to convert his basement into Section 8 housing, which is essentially housing that's created specifically to be rented out or given to people that have a disability of some kind, or someone who's potentially recovering from some horrible addiction. Someone who has a disability to some degree, whether that disability is physical, mental, or addiction related. And he probably, maybe he needed the money, but for whatever reason, he decided to make his property in the basement open to somebody to live there, to pay rent. It's a little extra money coming in to help him and his family. And it seemed like a good idea that he would let his old friend Renee Sandich move in. By this point, Gary Lewis is roughly about 60 years old. Sandich is only a couple years younger than him, 57, 58 years old. And she obviously needs a place to live. As I mentioned, she'd had, addiction problems in the past. She also had, from what I've seen, pretty serious mental health problems. So she was, really struggling and really messed up from a collection of different things. And Gary Lewis opened up his basement for her to come live in. It seemed like something that would work, a way to help out an old friend of his. And unfortunately, it's really a story about two sides of each coin. I've just mentioned the struggles that Renee Sandich had. Gary Lewis was obviously a little screwy himself. He had a history of drug abuse. He was also a survivalist, so he was also obviously very, who knows where his brain was going in that regard. But around this time, 2013, 2014, he was developing other issues that were kind of affecting him a little bit. So you've got this guy who's not quite all there at this point, bringing on a woman to live Section 8 housing who's also not quite all there. And it's, things started falling apart very quickly. And Renee Sandich, not just to Gary Lewis and his family, but to the whole, it seems that whole street they lived on. Neighbors said that she literally terrorized them. She was always out in the front yard, like yelling at people. She was obviously very screwed up by this point. And the biggest issue that she was creating, besides the fact that she was probably screaming and causing havoc left and right in the household itself, was she was constantly contacting the authorities to report something that Gary Lewis hadn't done for her. And because she was, technically disabled and was living in Section 8 housing, every complaint she would make, Gary Lewis would get a fine or a citation for. I think he pretty much got a fine every time. So she would complain about how the heating wasn't working properly, or how she didn't have a sufficient light outside her room to illuminate the area when she came in. She made multiple complaints to authorities about trash or debris being out in the front yard of the house, electricity problems, kitchen sink problems. I know that got reported on at some point or another. And it's just, as these are piling up, every single one of these is another citation, it's another fine on Gary Lewis. And it's like, how the human condition, even if you're fully functional, as opposed to Gary Lewis, who had his issues, you're fully functional, you're a normal functioning human being, and someone is just, someone who you're actually trying to help is constantly on a daily basis making your life a nightmare. And I think about that and I think, I don't know what I would do in that scenario. I would probably be furious after time to lengths that I, to this point in my life, have not experienced. And then especially you think about how your family's being affected like this. And, and then you think somebody who's in not a great mental position like Gary Lewis, what is he capable of in this situation? So things are deteriorating at a serious, frantic rate. And it really culminates in November 2013. Renee Sandich has a friend come over to the house. That friend, according to news and police reports, dies in the home from a heroin overdose. Dies in the home. So, I mean, it's one thing to be complaining and getting, having to deal with fines that are constantly coming at you because someone's constantly complaining about you. But that is a whole other thing. That is, a danger being brought into your own home by someone who's living there. And it's interesting that right around the same time in November, Gary Lewis, who by this time has been trying to get Renee Sandich evicted from his home, but she has Section 8 housing, and it's just, you can't just say, oh, they didn't do this, oh, this, I had this boarder come on and they called my daughter a bitch and then threw her favorite toy out the window or something. This isn't just a random person, this is Section 8 housing. It's a lot harder to evict somebody. Sometimes it's damn near impossible. So Lewis is having, no success trying to get Sandich out of her house, who is now just tormenting the whole family. And his wife, right around the time this heroin death happens, tries to take out a restraining order against Renee Sandich. It's been described as a restraining order in some sources and a stalking claim in other sources. And that effort was quashed pretty quickly. And I get the feeling that that was an effort on their family to try to find another way to get her evicted. I mean, if you take out a restraining order on somebody who's living in your house and that's granted, that person has to go. So things are continuing to deteriorate. Things are not getting better. They're just getting more and more tense as we transition from 2013 to 2014. And Renee Sandich has been living there for a long time, and she's continuing to file complaints, and Gary Lewis is continuing to, get these complaints filed against him while he's thinking that the world could collapse at any given moment and he's going to have to dive into his bunker and prepare for the, the afterworld or whatever was going around his mind. It's getting really, really bad. And there's even a moment where you think there's going to be some relief, where in April 2014, Renee Sandich apparently says she files another complaint, but she says she's planning on moving out of the house really soon. And unfortunately, that never happened. And in hindsight, it would have been great if she would have stuck to that statement and moved away. Because you flash forward ahead a little bit more, it's June 6th, 2014. Renee Sandich files another complaint, trying to get authorities to forcibly make Lewis agree and comply with these certain disability needs that she's claiming he's still not providing her. And he's probably too flat broke by this time to provide him to her, I don't know. And this is June 6th she files this complaint. And it's also on June 6th that Gary Lewis's daughter is spending the night at a friend's house, so she's not home. Gary Lewis's wife is visiting relatives who are in from out of country. So that night, it's only Gary and Renee in the home. The following morning, June 7th, 2014, Gary's daughter comes home, and when she arrives, she sees her father dragging something under a tarp in the backyard. She said she thought he was carrying something that looked like bleach, and she thought she got the feeling that it might have been a body. She gets concerned, she leaves, and, tells some, I believe she went and told the mother, and this is kind of interesting. They contact the police to say, we have reason to be concerned about this property, and the idea was that the authorities were supposed to go do a welfare check on the property. Now, when you're thinking a welfare check, that's like, hey, do a drive-by, take a look, see if anything's suspicious, maybe go up to the door, knock on it, and see, if anything out of the norm is going on. And yet, a bunch of homicide detectives report to the scene. Now, they may have been told by the daughter that she thought maybe there was a body being carried under the tarp, but still, that's not like an identification. Hey, my dad was dragging a woman's body. Then, yeah, I understand homicide detectives being out there, but it is a little suspicious that there were homicide detectives going out there based on a general hunch. Like, maybe you have some in the area, but just do a drive-by. Don't get, the neighbors all frantic if it's a misunderstanding. And just the whole conception of that day is very strange. I know neighbors in the area were kind of baffled. And the idea was the authorities were going to the property to check on Renee Sandich to see if she's okay. Obviously, Gary Lewis is okay, but is is there a body under this tarp? And is it Renee? You know, those were the only two that were home the night before. And the police, you know, maybe they have it on authority to some extent that, you know, they know that Gary Lewis, I mean, the police had to report to the house several times with all the complaints that were coming out of that house over the past year and a half. You know, maybe they knew that Gary Lewis was kind of a survivalist, and the authorities were concerned that the house might be booby-trapped. They also thought that Gary was maybe held up in the house. They arrived, they had their, you know, bullhorn out, screaming for Gary Lewis to come out of the house. He never did, because when the police showed up, he wasn't there. And finally, after waiting for a while, authorities start shooting tear gas into the house and proceeding, you know, firearms ready in case anything happens. And finally, they're able to begin searching the area, because now, not only is Renee Sandich unaccounted for, Gary Lewis is also unaccounted for. And it's very interesting if you look at the early reports, and if you even go on to websites like Web Sleuths, where you see people, you know, as things are going on, trying to figure out what's happening. And everybody's confused, because they're like, okay, why are homicide detectives already there? Why are they pursuing the house so aggressively? They were there to look for this woman, but wait, now they're looking for the guy. Like, they were worried about the woman's welfare, but now they're worried about his welfare. Is somebody dead? Are they both dead? Did somebody kill both of them? Did one guy kill the woman? Did the woman kill the guy? There was a lot of confusion going on at this time. And it takes the authorities a really long time to search the crime scene, because they're worried about the house being booby-trapped. And I want to say there was at least some reports that there were booby traps to an extent. It's interesting, because you think this guy, like, I understand this guy's a survivalist, but he has his wife, he has a kid living at home, he has a disabled woman living at home. I mean, how intense were these booby traps? Because somebody would have set one off eventually, you'd think. And because they're having to pursue so slowly, the 7th turns into the 8th, turns into the 9th. They still don't know where either of these two people are. And then finally, you know, they've beaten the house up. There was a trailer parked in the parking lot that literally got ripped open during their search. And ultimately, you know, they kind of made it from the front of the house to the back of the house, and there was a little shed in the backyard. And while authorities wouldn't admit to where the discovery was made, it later on was determined that Renee Sandich's body was found in this shed, which makes sense if you think Gary Lewis is seen dragging a tarp that we now know did have her body under it, and he's dragging it through the backyard, and there's this shed in the backyard, and he'd obviously put the body up in there and then put up a false wall. So she was finally discovered, unfortunately dead. But then the problem is, where is Gary Lewis at? And it's interesting, he is spotted by someone 2 days later. Renee Sandich is found June 10th, and Gary Lewis is found June 12th. He's seen literally only a couple of blocks from his house. Someone spots him, the police show up and apprehend him like that. And, you know, you're thinking, like, what was this guy thinking? Like, they've been searching his property for days, they found this woman, and I'm wondering if, you know, he's on the lam. Like, he manages to hide her body, and then the police show up, and it's like, okay, I gotta bail out of there. But, you know, they're not finding the body right away, and I'm wondering if Gary Lewis was lingering in the neighborhood, hiding somewhere. We don't really know exactly where he was during this, you know, these 5 days between Renee Sandich disappearing and then him being apprehended. I'm thinking that he was probably loitering around because he was looking for a possible opportunity. If the police don't find the body yet, if he could somehow sneak back onto the property and maybe move her and put her somewhere else, and then he at least, you know, maybe buys himself some time, or, you know, if they finally find him and put the finger on him, they don't have a body, they don't necessarily have a crime scene yet, it's a lot harder to bust somebody on that. because I'm thinking, why are you loitering only a couple of blocks from your home? It seems to me he was trying to find a way back home, either to move Renee's body or maybe there was other things that could potentially get him in trouble for. It's known that there was like a hammer discovered there that was professed later on to have been the primary murder weapon. Maybe he wanted to grab something like that. He was trying to clean up the crime scene, hopefully before the police did. And that's why he gets busted right around the corner from his own house, because you'd think by that point, if he knew all the details and knew that she'd already been found and that the scene had, had all been processed, it's like, okay, well, they found her, they know it's me, I need to get out of town. But no, he's still in town. And yeah, officially, it was determined Renee Sandage died. The cause of her death was blunt force trauma, predominantly by use of a hammer. So you take everything leading up to this moment, and you take the fact that literally Gary Lewis beat this disabled woman to death with a hammer. And you have to think, like, I think something really came to a head. It's just the two of them home. She's filed another complaint against him that day. He's probably beyond sick of it. He feels trapped. He's obviously already a very paranoid guy who's, has issues of his own. It's just, what kind of things are going to happen when you have two people that are fairly messed up and they're in a stressful, tense situation that it seems like there's no way out of. It's just ongoing. I'm not justifying what this guy did in the slightest. I do understand that if I had someone who was creating as much havoc for me and my family as this woman reportedly was, I'd do everything in my power to get her out of my house, and every single day I would be trying to find a way to get her out of my house. But all that being said, if it turns out that this is like a very long-term situation, I'm not going to just haul off and kill her one day. But I assume, of much more sound mind than Gary Lewis was by the summer of 2014. And I think that's it. I think things came to a head. His family wasn't home to maybe help keep him in line. And obviously I think there was some serious altercation, and he finally hit his limit, and I think he went into just an insane blind rage, which would lead someone to committing a murder this brutal. It's not like he just punched her. He pulls out a hammer. I mean, a hammer is going to disfigure you. That is, I don't even want to think about it. And he just beats her to death with this thing. And I'm reading all this and I'm thinking, all I was looking for, when this day started, when I first learned about this crime, I'm just looking up the addresses to houses that have been demolished recently. And then something like this falls right into my lap. And ultimately, July 2014, only a month later, Gary Lewis is arraigned for this murder that, he doesn't really have a lot to stand on. In addition to his daughter's identification, the bodies found on the property, there were also I think it was maybe even his own security cameras, because Gary Lewis had put up security cameras. I think people claim that was to monitor and catch on film some of the crazy stuff that Renee Sandage was doing, because she apparently would loiter and act crazy in front of the house a lot. But the guy was a survivalist. I think a lot of this, cameras being up to catch surveillance footage around his house was part of his own paranoia in that regard. And yeah, they said surveillance footage literally caught him dragging her body, to the shed. So this guy didn't have a leg to stand on. But still, when he's arraigned, he pleads not guilty. I can't remember for certain, but I'm assuming they were probably trying to come up with some kind of insanity plea. Play up that survivalist aspect of things and the fact that he was having some health issues of his own, and he had diminished capacity and he just snapped one day, so let's give the guy a break. That's about the best defense you could even offer for this guy in a case as open and shut like this. But ultimately, it takes till January 2017 before he's finally convicted of this crime. And what's very interesting is you have indisputable evidence that this guy beat this woman in a very violent, rage-filled way. Even if you understand that this was most likely the result of rage compounding upon rage over months and months and months that brought this about. This was a violent crime wherein Gary Lewis was 100% guilty. And despite all that, he was only given a 16-year sentence with the possibility of parole in 10 years. So by 2027, he might get out of prison. He'll be, 74, 75 by then. But I mean, if you're a guy who's 61 years old and you beat a woman to death with a hammer and it's definitively proven that you did it and you're convicted in a court of law, it's shocking to think that you would ever get paroled before you would just die in prison. But that was the sentence, and I'm sure a lot of people were floored, disgusted by that, and I'm thinking maybe that was just, the legal system acknowledging that this guy did have some issues and that this woman was making his life a living hell. It doesn't justify the guy's actions. You don't let someone walk away with like a suspended sentence for doing something like that, but maybe that played into things a little bit. So instead of giving this guy like a life sentence like you would expect for a killing like this, he gets 16 years, and I guess the idea is if he ever does get out of prison, he's not going to have much life left. He'll hopefully be too old and frail to ever even, bruise anybody, much less kill somebody by that point. But whatever the case, it's a surprisingly small sentence for what the guy did. And just a crazy story about what happens when you have two people who just aren't 100% there and they're just going at each other. And bad things happen in scenarios like this, and it's even more sad to think that these people met, like a Narcotics Anonymous trying to recover from drug addictions, and they managed to forge a friendship in that way that was still existent, 30 years later, and yet it all ended with murder. So anyway, that's the story. And welcome back to me. Back on site. Again, I'm a little ways away from the houses because I don't want to be just standing in front of their houses, just videoing myself, freaking them out, even though I'm kind of standing in front of other people's houses. But hey, this house has their curtains shut, so they don't give a shit, obviously. Anyway, I just thought, oh, creepy, interesting that there was like one of the properties I'm looking up, there was like a murder that happened there. But anyway, from the site, or near the site, where a murder occurred, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian, and there's kind of a bug floating around me, so I should get out of here. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.